Right, I wanted to share with you one of my best recipes. It's my ESSE loaf. It's my bread. It's my loaf of bread that I bake on my ESSE. The ESSE is just absolutely perfectly suited for baking bread. The results are always top notch. They always knock the supermarket bread out of the water, and it's so easy to do. I've got my ingredients here. All they need is weighing up. For this loaf I'm going to use 750 grams of strong white bread flour, okay? And I'm being a bit lazy. I'm going to knead it in the machine here. I'm only doing that to speed things up a bit. Now you could use just strong white bread flour, but I like to mix them up a bit. This is a wholemeal flour, so I'm going to use 250 grams of this. It gives me 1 kilo in total. And the combination of the two flours just makes the bread a little bit more interesting, a little bit more kind of toothsome, and you know, you've got that wholemeal element, which I really like. 250 grams to make up to 1 kilo. Okay, so that's our two flours weighed up. We've got 1 kilo, 750 grams of the strong white bread flour, and 250 grams of the wholemeal. When I make bread, I work with a 2%, 1% ratio. So for every kilo of flour, I'm going to add 20 grams of salt and 10 grams of yeast. So with our 1% yeast, we're looking for 10 grams. That's the yeast in. And our 2% salt, we're going to go for 20 grams. But if you're not that into salt, or you're watching out for it, you can cut it down a little bit. We're looking for 20 grams. Now, we can start to work this flour now, mixing that salt and yeast nice and gently, while I measure out the water. For every kilo of flour, I'm looking for 600 mils of kind of blood temperature water. So the water can go straight in, trying not to spill it. And as soon as that mixes in with the flour, the dough's going to start to come together. We're going to let this bread knead now for about 5 minutes. It's a really important process of bread making, whether you're doing it by hand and working out your shoulders at the same time, or doing it in a machine. What you're aiming to do is develop the structure of the bread. And that kneading process, that working of the flour, is really integral to a really good loaf. So we're going to let that do its thing just for a few more minutes. That looks really good, ready to go. Just going to get a feel for it with my hands and just make sure I'm happy with the overall texture of the dough. What we're going to do is just shape that into a little round, and I'm going to use this bowl to let it prove. We're going to put that somewhere warm for about 2 hours, okay? It's going to double in size. The yeast is going to do its work, feeding on the natural sugar in the flour, developing carbon dioxide, which makes the bread rise. The whole thing is going to develop in flavour. We're going to come back to that in a bit. I'm going to show you how to shape your loaf and bake it. Right, I'm going to knock back this bread. It's had about 2.5 hours proving, somewhere warm. You can see it's doubled in size. You know, it really is quite spongy. If I give it a punch, knocks the air straight out of it. That's what we want to do, because we're going to take this dough and shape it into a loaf. So this was a kilo batch of dough. I'm going to split about 1/3 of it off, and I'm going to save that. I might later on make some pizzas for the girls. That piece of dough will be fantastic for that job. The rest of it I'm going to shape into a loaf. This is a free-form loaf, or what I call a free-form loaf. So I'm not using a loaf tin or anything like that. It's going to be baked straight on the oven floor. So this final rising of my shaped dough is going to take place on the top here, and then I'm going to bang it straight on the oven floor. And it's a really nice thing to do, and it's really only the ESSE with its, you know, solid base of the oven that this works so successfully on. Tapping it out like that just helps to give you your initial shape to your bread, okay? Clock face. When I shape my loaf, I bring in the corners like this, as if you're working around the face of a clock. And what this does is gives the bread its structure and shape, and it helps it to rise, and as it hits the oven floor it gives it that great round shape and just aligns all the gluten in the bread. I'm going to turn it over and I'm just going to finish shaping it this way. This is quite an interesting method where you twist the loaf, and using the sides of your palms you're actually tucking the bread under itself, tightening the whole structure up further. Right, I've got a clean tea towel here. That goes down on my surface, and onto that just a little bit of wholemeal flour. This is where my bread's going to have its final rising session, right? It's a really nice thing to sit it on because it doesn't stick to anything with that flour, and I can use this tea towel again the next time I make bread. Flour goes on top. Onto my floured shaped loaf, just a little bit of cling film. It's just going to keep the moisture in there as this has its final rise. Right, my bread has had about 40 minutes having its final rise. It's ready to go in the oven and I can't waste any time. When I say in the oven, I mean straight on the oven floor. I did mention that earlier. Before I put it in, I'm just going to give it a good clean, and I just do that with my tea towel. Make sure there's no loose crumbs or anything like that on there. And she's ready to go. Keep the oven heat up, okay? We're going to pick up our bread. Cling film comes off, and I'm going to actually use a bread knife, a serrated knife, just to slash the bread. It just helps it to spring up in the oven. Just a few slashes like that. So I'm going to open the oven door. I'm going to very carefully pick up my loaf without knocking the air out of it, and it goes straight on the oven floor like that. Wow. There she is. That's my ESSE loaf cooked on the floor of the oven. It's had about 45, 50 minutes in there, and I like cooking it for that length of time because you get this really good crust. That's going to soften over the next 10 minutes, but it will still be crunchy.